Walking you down the aisle would be disrespectful to your stepfather. My mother stood in the doorway of my bedroom, her voice perfectly flat, delivering the final verdict on my wedding. 2 weeks before I was supposed to get married, she erased me. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I just looked at the woman who had spent my entire life pretending I didn't exist and realized my subscription to this family had officially expired. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. My name is Elena. I am 28 years old and I am an architect. I build foundations for a living, ensuring structures can withstand immense pressure. But the foundation of my own life had been built on quicksand. While I sat in my room processing my mother Brenda's words, my stepsister Paige was downstairs finalizing the floral arrangements for her own upcoming wedding. Paige's floral budget alone was $24,000. My mother and my stepfather Curtis were funding every single cent of it. Meanwhile, my own wedding was a modest affair I had financed entirely by myself. For 20 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. When Curtis married my mother, I was 8. Paige was 10. From the moment they moved in together, the hierarchy was established. Paige was the golden child, the prized asset. I was the liability they merely managed. I got the hand-me-downs. Paige got the brand new car at 16. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my architecture degree. Paige took a 6-month vacation through Europe on Curtis's credit card. I never complained. I never fought back. People looking from the outside often wonder why someone stays in a situation where they are constantly undervalued. They ask why you don't just walk out the door. What they do not understand is the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a psychological prison without bars, constructed from years of subtle, relentless conditioning. When you are taught from childhood that your worth is tied solely to your utility, you develop a terrifying kind of learned helplessness. You stop fighting the current and learn to hold your breath underwater. You convince yourself that enduring the mistreatment is simply the cost of keeping a roof over your head. You accept the silence because speaking up only brings harsher penalties. I was useful when they needed someone to house sit, useful when they needed free architectural mock-ups for Curtis's office renovations, useful when they needed a quiet scapegoat to absorb their stress. But when it came to the one day that was supposed to be mine, walking me down the aisle was suddenly a bridge too far. Curtis felt it would diminish his role as the patriarch. So my mother cut me out without a second thought. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only absolute clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. And the numbers no longer made sense. I opened my laptop and started clicking cancel on the catering, the venue, and the modest dress order. If I was going to be an orphan, I was going to be an efficient one. My grief was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I didn't shed a single tear over my canceled wedding. Instead, I opened a new spreadsheet. I named it the audit. Curtis was an insurance salesman. He made a decent living, but certainly not the kind of liquid capital that supported $24,000 floral budgets and spontaneous European vacations, not without illegally leveraging other assets. I began digging through the digital archives of our family's finances. I had maintained access to an old shared drive from when I handled their tax document scanning years ago. It was a tedious chore, Curtis deemed beneath him. That supreme arrogance was about to cost him everything. For 4 days, I barely slept. I tracked every transfer, every withdrawal, every questionable deposit. I documented his manipulative behavior, compiling a rigid timeline of when large sums of money moved out of an account I didn't recognize and directly into Paige's personal checking. It was methodical, clinical work. I cross-referenced the dates of Paige's lavish purchases with the withdrawal records. A new designer wardrobe for Paige perfectly aligned with a transfer of $8,000. Paige's down payment on her luxury condo mirrored a transfer of $65,000. The greed was staggering, sloppy, and entirely devoid of conscience. But the most glaring anomaly was the source account itself. It was a trust. My biological father had died when I was 4 years old. I was always told he left us nothing but debts and empty promises. My mother had repeated that narrative so often it became the absolute truth of our family lore. Curtis played the savior, stepping in to rescue the destitute widow and her burden of a child, but the routing numbers told a completely different story. The trust was established 3 weeks before my father passed away. It was a life insurance payout and a substantial portfolio of diverse investments. It wasn't meant for my mother. It was explicitly meant for me. I traced the money trail with the precision of drafting a skyscraper's blueprint. Curtis had been bleeding the trust dry for a decade. He hadn't just stolen my father's legacy. He had used it to elevate his own biological daughter into high society while making me scrub floors to pay for my own university textbooks. The anger I felt wasn't a raging fire. It was liquid nitrogen. It froze every lingering attachment I had to these people. They hadn't just neglected me. They had financed their entire illusion of superiority using my stolen inheritance. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or demand answers. Confrontation without leverage is just a useless tantrum. I needed a lethal weapon. I printed out every bank statement, every forged transfer request, every piece of evidence that proved Curtis had systematically looted my future to pay for Paige's present. I placed them neatly into a manila folder. I was no longer an invisible daughter. I was a creditor coming to collect. I scheduled a meeting with Marcus Vance, one of the most ruthless forensic accountants and estate lawyers in the city. I didn't bring emotions into his office. I brought hard data. I laid the manila folder on his polished mahogany desk. I told him I needed a comprehensive audit of a trust fund and immediate legal action against the executor. Marcus reviewed the documents for 30 minutes in absolute silence. When he finally looked up, his expression was entirely professional. He confirmed my suspicions, but he uncovered the secondary twist that I had missed in my initial review. Curtis hadn't just drained the account. He had forged my signature on a series of release documents when I turned 18. The trust was legally designed to transfer to my direct control upon my 18th birthday. Curtis had fabricated a legal waiver, complete with a notarized signature from a corrupt notary who happened to be one of his old insurance buddies, granting him permanent power of attorney over the assets. He had literally stolen my identity to drain the trust left by my late father, all to finance Paige's luxury lifestyle. The total amount misappropriated was over $450,000. With interest and punitive penalties, the number was utterly devastating. Marcus looked at me and asked what my objective was. I told him this wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I wanted every cent returned, and I wanted Curtis held criminally liable for fraud and forgery. Marcus drafted the emergency injunctions and the civil suit filings that very afternoon. We had them sealed, ready to be served. The timing was entirely up to me. Paige's wedding was scheduled for that coming Saturday. Curtis had rented out a historic country club, inviting 300 of the city's most elite residents. It was meant to be his crowning social achievement, paid for exclusively with my dead father's money. I could have had the papers served to his office. I could have handled it quietly through private mediators, but Curtis and my mother had made their choices publicly. They had proudly told their social circle that I wasn't having a wedding because I simply couldn't afford it, while parading Paige around as the epitome of success. They had denied me the basic dignity of walking down the aisle solely to protect his fragile ego. I decided it was only fair that I attend Paige's wedding after all. Not as a sister, and certainly not as a bridesmaid. I was attending as the professional architect of their destruction. I purchased a stunning crimson dress, entirely inappropriate for a subtle family member, but perfectly suited for an executioner. I had the legal documents duplicated and placed into a sleek black leather portfolio. I was going to flip the script, and I was going to do it in front of the very audience they had paid my money to impress. Saturday arrived with perfect cloudless weather. I arrived at the country club exactly 10 minutes before the reception was scheduled to begin. I bypassed the ceremony entirely. Vows meant absolutely nothing to these people. The reception was where the real social transactions happened. I walked into the grand ballroom just as the 300 guests were finding their designated seats. The crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead. The $24,000 worth of white orchids cascaded beautifully from the centerpieces. It was a breathtaking masterpiece of stolen wealth. I walked straight to the head table. My mother saw me first, her face drained of all color. She stood up abruptly, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. Curtis followed her gaze, his expression shifting rapidly from jovial host to furious patriarch. Paige, still in her custom silk gown, looked at me with pure, unfiltered disdain. "What are you doing here?" my mother hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention from the elite guests. "You were explicitly told not to come." "I RSVP'd yes to the open bar," I replied evenly. Curtis stepped forward, attempting to physically block my path to the table. "Get out, Elena, now. Before I have security remove you from the premises. You are not going to ruin your sister's day." "She is not my sister," I said, my voice carrying just enough to silence the tables closest to us. "And this isn't her day. It's mine. I paid for it." The music suddenly stopped playing. The ambient chatter of the ballroom died down into a suffocating, heavy, quiet, 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the head table. I opened the black leather portfolio. I pulled out the top document, the forensic audit signed by Marcus Vance. I handed it directly to Curtis. "What is this?" he demanded, though his eyes darted nervously to the bold print at the top of the page. "That is an itemized invoice," I stated clearly, ensuring the wealthy guests hanging on my every word could hear perfectly. "It details the $450,000 you embezzled from my late father's trust fund over the last 10 years. It also includes the forensic proof of the signature you forged when I turned 18, utilizing your friend at the notary office." Curtis froze entirely. The color completely vanished from his face. The aggressive posture evaporated in an instant, replaced by the rigid panic of a trapped animal. Paige stepped forward, her face flushed with extreme anger. "You are insane!" "Dad, tell security to throw her out. She's making this up because she's a jealous failure." "Am I?" I pulled out the bank transfer records. I dropped them onto the pristine white tablecloth right in front of her plate. $65,000 for your condo down payment, transferred directly from my trust. $8,000 for your designer wardrobe. And this venue, these flowers, all paid for by a dead man who intended that money for his actual daughter. The guests began to whisper. The whispers quickly turned into a low, collective murmur of absolute shock. The foundation was cracking, and I was swinging the sledgehammer. The power dynamic flipped in a matter of seconds. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd finally stopped playing along. Curtis's hands shook violently as he stared at the legal filings. He knew exactly what Marcus Vance's name at the top of that letterhead meant. It meant federal prison. "Elena, please," Curtis whispered, his voice cracking pitifully. The authoritative patriarch was completely gone. "We can talk about this. In private. Don't do this here." "We had 20 years to talk in private, Curtis. You chose to steal in private. We are handling the accounting in public." My mother grabbed my arm, dark tears streaming down her face. "How can you do this to your family? To your sister? You severed our family ties 2 weeks ago when you told me my existence was disrespectful to him," I pointed at Curtis. "You made your transaction. Now you get to live in it." Paige started sobbing loudly, looking around at her wealthy new in-laws, whose expressions had morphed from polite confusion to absolute horror. The groom's family was old money, built entirely on reputation and public trust. Fraud was the ultimate, unforgivable sin in their circle. The groom's father stood up, threw his silk napkin on the table, and walked out of the ballroom without a single word. The groom immediately followed him. Paige collapsed into her chair, her perfect day utterly ruined by the truth. Curtis fell to his knees. He actually dropped to his knees in his tailored tuxedo, begging me to withdraw the criminal complaint. He pleaded for mercy, promising to pay back every cent. It was pathetic. Looking at him groveling on the floor, I saw the ultimate illusion of power of an empty wallet. People like Curtis build their entire identity on the external markers of wealth. They believe that having expensive things makes them superior beings. But their power is merely rented. When the money is exposed as stolen, the facade crumbles entirely, revealing the hollow, desperate core underneath. They mistake consumption for character. Without the stolen funds propping up their fragile egos, they had absolutely nothing of value to offer the world. They were spiritually bankrupt long before they became financially bankrupt. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no joy, no sadness. Just the clinical satisfaction of a closed account. The civil suit demands full restitution with interest. I told him, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. The criminal fraud charges carry a mandatory minimum sentence. My lawyer will be in touch on Monday. Enjoy the cake. I turned my back on them and walked out of the ballroom. I didn't look back. The murmurs of the crowd parted for me like water. I walked out the grand double doors of the country club, leaving the ruins of their lives behind me. The retaliation was complete. The aftermath was as swift as it was brutal. By Monday morning, Marcus Vance had officially filed both the civil suit and the criminal charges. Curtis's assets were frozen immediately. The insurance firm he worked for fired him the moment the fraud investigation became public, terrified of the massive liability. Without his income and with his accounts locked, the country club life evaporated overnight. Paige's new husband filed for an annulment exactly 4 days after the wedding. His elite family wanted absolutely no connection to a public embezzlement scandal. Paige was forced to sell the luxury condo to cover her mounting legal fees, moving back into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. My mother called me exactly once. She left a hysterical voicemail begging me to drop the charges, claiming Curtis's health was failing rapidly from the stress. I deleted the voicemail halfway through and blocked her number permanently. I had no obligation to cushion the fall they had engineered themselves. The legal battle was brief because the paper trail was indisputable. Curtis pled guilty to avoid a drawn-out public trial, receiving a 4-year sentence in a state facility. The civil court awarded me full restitution, liquidating his remaining retirement accounts and forcing the sale of their home to cover the stolen trust funds and the accrued interest. The money was returned to me, every single cent. But the money was entirely secondary to the peace it bought me. I used a portion of the recovered funds to start my own independent architectural firm. I bought a quiet, mid-century house with a sprawling garden, far away from the elite neighborhoods my family used to haunt. My days are now filled with drafting designs, tending to my plants, and surrounding myself with people who value me for who I am, not what I can do for them. I don't feel the need to look over my shoulder. I don't wait for the other shoe to drop. The silence in my home isn't the oppressive silence of being ignored. It is the comforting quiet of absolute freedom. Looking back on those 20 years in the shadows, I've come to realize that being pushed to the periphery of your own life is a unique kind of trauma. This is a letter to those who always feel on the edge of the circle, to the ones who are tolerated but never truly celebrated, to the ones who constantly shrink themselves to avoid disrupting the peace of people who do not care about your peace. You are not broken for wanting to be seen. You are not demanding for wanting basic respect. The guilt you feel for wanting to walk away is a mechanism installed by the very people benefiting from your compliance. They rely on your empathy because they completely lack their own. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You can forgive someone from a distance while keeping the door firmly locked. Cutting toxic ties is not an act of cruelty. It is the most profound form of self-love you can practice. You do not owe your loyalty to a bloodline that treats your existence as a transaction. You have the fundamental right to curate your life, to protect your energy, and to build a chosen family that views you as a foundation, not a footstool. The truth is, we spend so much time mourning the family we wished we had that we delay building the life we actually deserve. True family is not determined by DNA. It is determined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the genuine desire to see you thrive. I spent 2 decades being the invisible daughter, the useful asset, the quiet girl in the corner. It took having my very dignity denied to realize I held the keys to my own cage all along. The moment I stopped accepting their currency of guilt, their entire empire collapsed. I am no longer an invisible daughter. I am the architect of my own life, and the structures I build now are designed to last. If you've ever had to walk away from someone who didn't deserve your energy, hit that like button and share your story below. We're building a community that refuses to be silenced.